Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome to the Arturia Mini-V tutorial series. This is Arturia's fourth emulation, version 4, of probably the most famous synthesizer of all time. The Minimoog, released in 1970, essentially defined what it was, what it meant to be an analog synthesizer, and it just sounds absolutely unbelievable. Over the course of this series, we're going to deconstruct this synthesizer, figure out how it works, and today we're going to start with the Oscillator bank. Hope you enjoy this series, and if you do, check out the Patreon and channel member links below. It's a fabulous way to help support my channel so that I can carry on making these videos. And so, having had that tiny taste of how glorious the thing sounds, I'm going to throw all of that loveliness away and load up the default template. And now we have a much simpler sound. This is going to be a single sawtooth oscillator. Let's figure out how that sound's generated. The original Minimoog was a 3 oscillator synthesizer. You can see these rows, if you basically treat the rows in these two sections as interrelated, so any of the controls on these horizontal rows are going to have something to do with each other. We've got 3 separate oscillators, and at the moment you can only hear one of them. That's been determined by the mixer. Firstly, have a look at the volume controls. Oscillator 1 is turned up, oscillators 2 and 3 are turned down, so there's no chance that we can hear either of those. But in addition to the volume controls, we also have on-off switches. And in this default preset, oscillators 1 and 2 are on, and oscillator 3 is turned off. So even though oscillator 2 is currently engaged, we're not hearing it because its volume is turned down. We'll leave it that way for now and just concentrate on oscillator 1 for a moment longer. The sound that you heard is a sawtooth waveform. That's position 3 on the waveform selector. If I hold a key down and move the waveform knob, you'll see each of these shapes translated into the oscilloscope over on the right hand side. So that's a sawtooth plus a triangle, saw triangle. The triangle is the smoothest of the tones. Then we've got 3 different pulse waves. We have a square wave, which is a pulse wave with a 50% duty cycle. In other words, it's high as often as it's low. And then 2 variants of a pulse wave. We don't actually have pulse wave modulation per se in the primary synthesizer. As you'll discover later in this series, there are advanced features that give us access to a whole host of stuff. We're not going to worry about that today. We're just concentrating on the original synthesizer, and all of those advanced features are currently disabled. So here's pulse wave number 1, which is a wide rectangle, and then a narrow rectangle, and you can see in the oscilloscope the difference of those shapes. Fundamentally, it's just 6 different sound shapes to play with. Let's go back to the sawtooth, that's where we started. And now we'll have a play with the range control. This determines how high the pitch of the played key is. So at 8 foot, we have a pitch being generated 130 Hz. 8 foot stands for the length of a pipe on a pipe organ. It's literally the size of the pipe that would be required to generate that pitch of tone out of a church organ, to throw back to old times. If we half the size of the pipe, we're going to double the frequency, so now it'll generate a pitch at about 260, 261 Hertz. There we are, and pretty straightforward, 16 and 32. We'll leave discussion of low till a little bit later. That becomes interesting in oscillator 3. So that's your basic introduction to what an oscillator is. It's a thing that generates sound. In the circuitry of the synthesizer, there is a device that literally generates an oscillating control voltage, basically increasing and decreasing this control voltage very quickly. And if you do that 130 times a second and amplify the sound, you're going to hear an analog synthesizer tone. So at the moment, oscillator 1's doing all the heavy lifting. It's the only thing we can hear. Let's turn the volume down a little bit, so that I can introduce oscillator number 2. Now at the moment, all of its controls are identical to oscillator number 1. So if I turn that up to about halfway as well, press a key, getting quite an interesting sound there. That's 2 different sawtooth waveforms playing together, but it's an analog synthesizer. Nothing is quite perfect. And so these sawtooths are very slightly out of pitch with each other, out of tune. And that generates a really nice sound. It's called Unison detune. And this shape, this morphing shape that you can see in the oscilloscope is those two waves basically just gently playing against each other, generating this lovely sound. Just to prove that there's nothing fancy about Oscillator 2, if I turn Oscillator 1 down, there's our nice simple sawtooth. Now let's just have a bit of a think about that gently waving wave for a moment. Like I said, it's generated because we're emulating an analog synthesizer here. But Arturia have given us the option to remove that analogness if we wanted to. It's something that you would very rarely want to, because that's actually where the lovely warmth lives in an analog synthesizer. But let's have a play with the controls anyway to see what's going on. Over on the right hand side, we've got this control called vintage. This effectively allows us to specify the extent, the depth of that analog quality of the sound. As you can see, it's currently set to 2, which means we have a little bit of it. This is effectively like a Minimoog straight out of the factory. That's basically what we're emulating at the moment. This seemingly innocuous vintage control actually hides a lot of variable controls under the hood, and they're accessed from a hidden panel. If you hover over the Arturia logo, you can see that there's something kind of waiting to be discovered. Click on the logo, and we have 8 options that allow us to specify the extent of the analog nature of this synthesizer. 7 of these controls, all of these knobs, are tied to the vintage knob. And the one that we're interested in at the moment is the pitch control. You can see that pitch control is set to 0.8. That's contributing to this kind of random sound that we're hearing, but there's another factor in play as well. The 8th control is called keyboard tracking. This control in the bottom left-hand corner of the panel overrides or is basically independent of the vintage control. And when this is set to anything other than 0, we basically get like a different behavior, a different variance of analog behavior across the span of the keyboard. So if I disengage all of this stuff, if I set keyboard tracking to 0 and turn the vintage knob down, I've effectively disabled the analog nature of this synthesizer. And now when I play a key, those 2 oscillators are locked. They're both playing exactly the same pitch. This now gives us the ability to introduce, at our own discretion, the amount of variance, the amount of analog modulation that we want. So by turning the vintage knob up, I'm now reintroducing this pitch variance. If I then also reintroduce the key tracking modulation, it means every different key that I play on the keyboard is going to introduce a very slightly different amount of modulation, and we're back to our analog warmth. Each of the presets in the Arturia preset library have different amounts of this analog control dialed in. You could basically forget it and just leave that knob alone. Only when you get into very fine granular sound design do you need to particularly worry about that. I'm just bringing it to your attention because it actually colours everything that you hear. Every preset, every sound is subject to this vintage. It's called diffusion. Okay, let's get back to looking at the oscillators. So at the moment we're just hearing oscillators 1 and 2 and then morphing gently against each other again. Now I'm going to engage Unison mode. Here's the button. Let's turn that on. A radically different sound hits our ears. What's happening now is that basically the synthesizer has been quadrupled. Whatever you can see in these controls, there are 4 copies, 4 different voices, all generating the same preset sound, but they're slightly offset. If you have a look down at the bottom of the interface, these detune and spread values are connected with the Unison mode. If I turn off Unison mode, we go back to different options. We'll worry about what those options mean in a later episode of the series. Let's turn Unison back on. This detune and spread value is determining how offset in pitch and pan levels each one of those 4 voices is. And it's quite similar to the much more simple situation where we had 2 oscillators playing against each other. I described that as Unison detune. This is the same concept, just amplified, because now you've got 4 copies of the same synth sound, very slightly offset in pitch. And now we're starting to get that really thick, wonderful analog sound. But if we're trying to understand how controls work, having 4 copies of everything is a little bit confusing, so I'm going to turn this wonderful button back off again. Now let's have a look at Oscillator 3. It's a little bit different from the other two. Firstly, we've got this extra control on the left-hand side. We need to figure out what that does. But first things first, let's turn off oscillators 1 and 2. I'm going to turn on oscillator number 3 and turn its volume up, and let's see what we hear. That's not very interesting, is it? What you're hearing there is something that's oscillating so slowly you can't actually hear it. Oscillator 3 is currently operating in, I'm going to say, a low frequency mode, but as you'll see shortly, you can go even more low frequency than this. Firstly, the range knob is set to 32 foot, so it's generating the lowest of the standard octave-based tones, but then the pitch control has been turned all the way down to minimum as well. Just a quick note on the interface. The interface says -7 because the original synthesizer did, but the control itself actually goes down to -9 semitones. If I bring this control back up, eventually you get to the stage where you can hear it again. And if you watch it in the tuner and the oscilloscope, at about 25-30 hertz, the tuner loses track of what's going on. There we go, the tuner's now out of play. And you can still make out the pitch down to about 20 hertz. And then finally, it becomes inaudible. That's not as slow as Oscillator 3 can go. It can go even slower than that. But if I turn it into low frequency mode, you're not going to hear anything at all apart from a control voltage click. Here we go. Just hear that tiny little periodic click. Now Oscillator 3 is cycling way too slowly for us to be able to make out. The reason for giving us this feature is that Oscillator 3 can now be used as a modulator. Its primary purpose wasn't to be used as a third audible oscillator, although it can certainly do that. Its primary purpose was to act as a modulator on the other 2 oscillators. So let's just accept for the moment that we don't want to hear Oscillator 3. I'm going to turn its audible volume back off again so we can't hear its output. Now I'm going to have Oscillator 3 modulate the pitch of Oscillator 1, and we do that from the controllers section. On the left hand side we have this feature called oscillator modulation. Now it's an annoying dark grey on black button. It's very difficult to make out. It's here. It's currently turned on. If I click it, you might just be able to see that I just turned it off. I'm backlit here for the purpose of making a video, and I literally cannot see that button at all. I just have to click it again and hope that I've turned it back on again. Now I'm going to introduce this Oscillator 3 as a modulator by increasing the modulation amount. Turn it up to about halfway. Hear what happens. See the pitch going up and down? Well, you can hear it. The rate of that pitch variance is being controlled by Oscillator 3's speed, its rate, and at the moment, because it's in low frequency oscillator mode, cycling as slowly as it possibly can. That rise and fall of pitch on Oscillator 1 is as slow as it can be. I control the depth of modulation, in other words, how much Oscillator 3 is allowed to change or modulate Oscillator 1 with my modulation amount control. Now I can reintroduce oscillator number 2. So the 2 audible oscillators are both playing against each other, but Oscillator 3 is modulating the pitch of both of them. And if you set quite gentle amounts, you can see I really pulled the modulation amount quite far down there. You get quite a nice vibrato effect. Now here's the deal with low frequency oscillators. You do not want them tied to the keyboard. You don't want the rate, the speed of that low frequency oscillation to change for every different key that you press. And that's what the oscillator control button does. it disengages oscillator 3's rate from the keyboard. If I re-engage oscillator 3 control, it will now track with the keyboard. So every different key that I press on the keyboard is going to generate a very slightly different rate, speed of oscillation of oscillator 3, and that's going to translate as a different speed of vibrato. Let's turn it up a bit so that we can hear it nice and clearly. You can quite clearly hear those different speeds of vibrato because we're now keyboard tracking. So typically, if you're in low frequency oscillator mode, either 32 foot with your tuning all the way down, or in low frequency mode pretty much anywhere on the control, you want to disengage your keyboard input from oscillator 3 so that it can cycle in a stable fashion. I'm going to turn the modulation amount back down to 0, so oscillator 3 is no longer modulating oscillators 1 and 2. And now we're going to have a look at the drive and feedback controls. Drive first. Let's just get down to a single oscillator. Let's hear oscillator 1 on its own. Now I'm going to turn up drive. Have a look at it in the oscilloscope as I turn this control up. See it getting louder. It's basically overdriving the signal. Now what's going to happen eventually is that the signal is going to start clipping. In other words, the loudest part of the signal is going to exceed the synthesizer's capacity to actually generate a consistent waveform, and you're going to start basically cutting off the top and bottom because it's an analog signal, so it has positive and negative values. You're going to start literally chopping off parts of the wave, and this sawtooth wave is going to morph into a square wave as those peaks are clipped away. It also gets louder, so I need to turn it down. And there we go. We're turning it into a square wave. That's a really nice graphical and audible representation of what overdriving an analog signal does. It distorts it. As that distortion is introduced, this little red light turns on to tell you how much distortion is being introduced. Closely related to the drive feature is feedback. So I'll turn drive all the way down. Feedback literally sends a copy of the signal back into the synthesizer. That signal is then reprocessed. Feedback very quickly gets out of hand and can be quite a dramatic effect. So I'm going to turn the volume way down for this purpose. Now I'm going to start introducing feedback. You'll see the feedback light turn on as the feedback is introduced. Very subtle changes to either the volume or the feedback control are now going to have wild impacts on the tone. We have two different kinds of feedback mode, literally just different kinds of circuits. They're going to generate again different range of options to play with. Let's have a listen to feedback 2. Tiny difference of volume control there had such a wild impact on the sound. If you overdrive that signal as well. Finally today, let's have a quick look at the noise module. I'm going to turn all of the primary oscillators off, so I have no sound. Now I'm going to introduce noise. White noise is an even distribution of frequencies across the audible spectrum. If I introduce pink noise, you're going to see some of the high frequencies attenuated. It's basically applying a low pass filter to the sound, and it's going to get duller. See those high frequencies being sculpted away. So in addition to the noise generator being capable of independent output in its own right, and a little bit mixed into the signal, you can't really hear the noise quite so much. It just kind of distorts the overall signal. You can't really hear that noise anymore, but it is there. See? But the noise module can also be used as a modulator. Let's turn its volume down so we can't hear the module itself. Oscillator 1 and 2, generating their composite sawtooths. And now I'm going to reintroduce my oscillator modulation, but this time my modulation mix is going to be turned all the way up to noise. So now the noise module is going to modulate the pitch of oscillators 1 and 2, not oscillator 3. Oscillator 3 is not doing any work at the moment. So there's no concept of frequency when it comes to noise. It's literally just a randomization. The oscillator is being, the pitch of oscillator 1 and 2 are being randomized. And that's the oscillators covered. Hope you enjoyed the video. Please hit like if you did. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. Helps me out with the YouTube stuff. I'll see you next time. Thanks a lot.